Hey, welcome to the Sixers Talk podcast. So glad you could join us. I'm Danny Pommells, along with Noah Levick, Ben Berry, our producer, always getting us hooked up and ready to go. It feels like the honeymoon period is over, Noah. A tough loss to the Nets, an overtime win against the Orlando Magic. It didn't quite feel like a win. And then this loss against the Nuggets where they blow a 19-point lead in the first half. A 19-point lead turns into a 4-point loss in a back-to-back. We'll get into this bench stuff that's going on with the 76ers as they were outscored heavily in this game and have been in a lot of games. I think a great place to start would be James Harden, Noah, after the game, talking about balance. And you watch the game, and he's trying to move the offense at his pace. He walks it up often. He's trying to find guys with these great pocket passes and pinpoint passes at times where that don't get through to guys. And he's also trying to balance that with how he scores and getting other guys involved. I think that is going to be a real growing pain for this team as he tries to figure that out, Noah. What's your perspective on how he's achieving that and how that played out last night against the Nuggets?
I actually thought last night's game was overall an encouraging one for Harden after some concerning signs in the past two. 3 for 17 against Brooklyn, and then against Orlando, another subpar shooting night, and just a lot of very stagnant late game possessions where he was holding the ball and didn't look particularly explosive on his drives. And the Sixers were lucky to squeak by in that game, in large part because Harden and Embiid are incredible at drawing free throws and capitalized on that against a young Orlando Magic team. But I thought last night Harden was good in taking what the defense gave him, or Denver trapped throughout the game, hit Embiid on the short roll, get your MVP candidate player the ball at the foul line. That's a pretty decent spot, and the Sixers will generally take that on most possessions. I think we see with Harden, like, it sure seems like he's going to need to be elite when Embiid is off the floor, because these minutes without Embiid and DeAndre Jordan on the floor just consistently feel profoundly unsteady, I think would be a fair way to classify that, as was the case when Paul Millsap was the backup five. And Harden last night stepped up, late in that third quarter, drew a bunch of free throws, hit a step back three. And the Sixers were well positioned to win this game, leading by, I believe, like 7 or 8 points heading into that fourth quarter. And then in a big surprise, Jokic is on the bench, Embiid's in the game, and DeMarcus Cousins nails a couple of threes, and Denver actually wins those minutes. So it was a weird game in some ways, but I think in terms of James Harden's performance, that's actually probably one of the more positive takeaways. And I thought overall he did well for the Sixers, despite some of these inherent difficulties with trying to figure out that right middle ground between attacking and being a facilitator for the Sixers.
Yeah, very interesting game, like you said. Embiid asked out of the game about 4 minutes in. We'll get into that, but just staying on Harden for a little while. It's interesting because in the Orlando game, the big three turned out to be Tobias Harris, Embiid, and Harden scoring-wise for the 76ers. Tobias Harris picking up a lot of slack in that Orlando game and really showing up when the Sixers needed it, because Tyrese Maxey wasn't quite himself playing off of that Nets game where he didn't quite have a great game. And then we come into the Nuggets game where the MVP matchup between Embiid and Jokic takes center stage. But the Nuggets bench has such an effect, and then Harden helps the Sixers get out to this big lead. Why couldn't they hold on to it? What was the issue, do you think, with the way that the Nuggets really closed that first half, and then the Sixers come out sleepwalking in the start of the third, and all of a sudden they're fighting from behind?
I think transition defense is a solid answer and has been consistently problematic. in that Orlando game, the Magic get the first 17 fast break points of the night, and Denver scores 29 fast break points. And I think you saw late in that second quarter, it just felt like they were so much faster than the Sixers and capitalizing on so many chances to get out in the open floor, with the highlight play being that nifty Jokic dish to Jeff Green to cut, a lead once as high as 19 points down to 5. So I think
was that the baseball pass? Was that the full length baseball pass? Or?
Yeah, kind of like a look off. I think one hand.
Oh, the no look. Yes.
Yeah,
there you go. Okay.
Which is pretty.
I think Kevin Durant commented on that on Twitter, saying how pretty that pass was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he is just brilliant as an all around player. And it was a fun game to watch. But I think that stretch, the Sixers could have avoided something that catastrophic if they just did some of the basics with loading up on defense and being attentive to not allowing so many transition points to the opposition. And Embiid after the game was pretty blunt in saying he thinks they've been lazy with transition defense, and he included himself among that group. So he thinks it's not anything super complex that needs to change schematically. It's just mostly effort-based. And then I think overall, we have to note that DeAndre Jordan missed a bunch of close-range shots, and his lack of mobility means that centers can shoot wide-open threes against him whenever they want to, and Jokic made one of them. And he just does not look like a great backup center option through 4 games, despite Doc Rivers giving quite a generous assessment of his play thus far and saying he's been great overall, and he thinks that Jordan is valuable for the Sixers as a player who rolls and runs the floor. He's trying to acclimate to a new situation, and I just think that doesn't override the fact that he doesn't look like a very good backup center option for this team thus far. And just it feels like whenever Embiid's off the floor, the Sixers are holding on for dear life, and they're not always successful at actually holding on.
Yeah, Doc Rivers even gave DeAndre Jordan an endorsement after the game, like you said, saying that he thought he played well, which, you use your eyes and judge that a little bit. You might not feel the same way. And it's interesting because you can go back to, and you look at the way the Sixers started the game, if we take it, compartmentalize it a bit, you can go back to the Nets game and Kevin Durant's comments afterward that he felt like the way the Sixers in that game hunted fouls or were trying to draw fouls, them going to the line either way a lot early in the game really slowed their offensive rhythm down. And you saw here in this game against the Nuggets, they hardly went to the line and got out to this fantastic lead and were getting up and down the floor. So it's something interesting to keep your eye on, because there is a part of Embiid and Harden's game where inducing fouls, drawing fouls, you really don't need to get, maybe Jokic, sure, but does indeed need to try to induce fouls against Andre Drummond, somebody who he's already dominant against and can get over on. Whereas in this Jokic game, maybe that would have benefited them to get him in foul trouble early. Embiid almost fouling out of this game with some close calls. But it's interesting because of the way the Sixers played this game and the growing pains they're going through, how that will play out, because baiting players and things like that is a part of both of their games, but also could lead to offensive issues where it does slow down other guys getting involved. Do you notice any of those things?
I think undeniably in the Brooklyn game, that was a huge problem for Harden. And there were a heaping handful of instances where he tried to draw fouls and was ineffective, and it resulted in negative plays, turnovers, transition offense for Brooklyn, etc. I think that was like the worst example of what you're saying that you could possibly imagine. I think outside of that,
the best of the worst, right?
Yeah, I think outside of that, drawing fouls has been, very positive for the Sixers. It's something they do better than anyone else in the NBA by a wide margin. And you do have to put effort into exploiting one of your biggest strengths. So I don't think
I think my point is kind of that it's different when it comes in the rhythm and flow of your natural offensive game, and it's different when you're okay. Embiid has that great rip through move when guys kind of have their hand in a cookie jar, but if you're kind of favoring drawing the foul as opposed to just playing basketball and shooting it, it's kind of like a fine line there. I think what I'm trying to explain is that, baiting players and whatnot and drawing fouls on natural offense is different than trying to like induce fouls kind of unnaturally.
Definitely. And I think also this team is trying to find answers on how to best incorporate those complementary players like Tyrese Maxey, Matisse Thybulle, Tobias Harris. And someone like Tobias Harris talks all the time about the importance of rhythm and ball movement and offensive flow, and a style of play that features foul drawing is not heavy on those, particular characteristics. But I just think it's really efficient offense. They're so talented at this particular skill, and you do need to lean into it. And for me, that feels especially true when Embiid is off the court and the Sixers are just relying on Harden, like making stuff happen in isolation, whether it's his own offense or driving and kicking or what have you. And late in that third quarter, he was great. He drew several fouls on the Nuggets. And, the flip side of that is it did halt some potential momentum that Denver could have gotten from the seemingly effortless transition offense that was there all night, because the Sixers were at least stopping the game, playing at their own deliberate pace, and scoring points with the clock stopped. So I think there's a lot of factors to consider there, obviously, but like it or not, this is now a big part of the Sixers' identity. Like, they've gone all in on offensively. We draw fouls exceptionally well, and we need to do that most likely to win a lot of games. So that's the way it is. And with Harden, I think the hope is just that the athleticism and the health and the instincts and the big game showing up, all of that stuff is there to enable him to draw fouls at a really elite level in big games.
Harden with just 11 shots last night. Fantastic from the free throw line, 11 of 12, a rebound short of a triple-double. Embiid, similar, 9 of 10 from the free throw line, 20 shots, though, for Embiid. And I mentioned off the top, Harden's trying to figure out this balance between the assist level with 11 last night and scoring the basketball with 24 points. So I would like him to see him put up more shots. I feel like, yes, he's trying to get other guys involved, and there is a tenuous line that he's trying to balance. But at certain instances, I would prefer him to shoot the ball than the other guys that are on the floor. But staying on that point, you have a night like last night, and then Tobias Harris has a night like he did against Orlando Magic, where he played really well and was able to hit a big three and make up for a lapse or a blown layup he had that could have put the Sixers ahead late in that game. The Sixers pull that one out. We hear after the Nuggets game, Tobias talking about how he's trying to get acclimated, how he's trying to get connected to this role and being more of a catch and shoot guy, and how that's playing out for him. Are we at a point where you feel like Tobias is going to be a player that can catch and shoot in the same clip, and I'm just using this comparison because they're on the same team, the way George Niang does? It seems like Niang would be a little bit better in that role with Harden on the floor, and maybe staggering Tobias and Niang in a different way. I mean, Tobias can still start, but maybe getting Niang more minutes on the floor where he can just be effective as the catch and shoot guy. And maybe Tobias has more opportunity to do a little bit more of what he's comfortable with. I know Doc Rivers is still trying to figure out these rotations and where guys fit and things like that. But do you feel like Tobias can thrive as the catch and shoot guy, maybe more than a Niang can with Harden on the floor?
Yeah, it's a big question mark, and a lot of it just comes down to instincts and the way he naturally plays, and that not being his default mode. But he did hit big catch and shoot threes in the Orlando game, and I think is capable of doing so in the playoffs. As far as the lineups, I think Rivers has a lot of tricky decisions to make here just because of some of the deficiencies with this roster. Like he was asked about Niang in particular, are there limitations on which lineups you can use him with? And he essentially said, well, he's going to play every night, and we feel that particular lineup with him and Harris together tends to work for us, and that Niang's shooting tends to be valuable there. I think more experimentation is certainly warranted. Like there needs to be some trial and error here to figure out what works and what doesn't. But I think what also makes it really difficult is Matisse Thybulle is so unique, and right now Rivers hasn't had confidence in him to play a lot of late game offensive possessions. So with that being the case, he wants his best players on the floor. He seemingly doesn't feel great about any of his other bench players. So it's almost like Harris and Niang are sharing the court in crunch time by default because he feels like his hand is forced, and Thybulle is not playable in some situations because of his offensive deficiencies. I think Thybulle is just fascinating overall, and is an inevitable X factor for this team in the playoffs. I asked Rivers, like, what is relevant with Thybulle with how you determine when and how he plays. And he essentially said he needs to be dynamic defensively to be on the floor. And he said it's comparable to Lou Williams, a player who was very strong offensively and weaker on the other end of the ball, where you need to be actively helping the team in a big way with your strength in order to warrant late game minutes. And obviously Thybulle did that in a huge way last night. Tied a career high with six steals, many of the spectacular variety. And yet he didn't play a ton late in the game because the Sixers still have these large concerns about having someone on the court that the other team every single time is going to help way off of, and that is going to inhibit their stars' ability to have optimal spacing, the type of spacing that you want late in close games. So I think with Niang, it's just really, really tough to figure out right now exactly where he fits. But he's somewhere in this equation. It's great that he wants to take catch and shoot threes and generally does so well. Last night was an off night. He missed a couple clutch ones and went 2 for 12 and looked tired, frankly, on the second night of a back-to-back.
Yeah, that's a great point because he has a tough shooting night and the bench just goes in the tank. But we're going to try to table that for the second half of the podcast because we're going to focus on Matisse Thybulle and his starting lineup a little bit more. He has this bounce back game after a scoreless time in Orlando, and he splashes a three early. He gets a couple steals, some quick buckets, and suddenly he's helping the Sixers to this 19-point lead. And you mentioned your question to Doc Rivers on him being dynamic defensively. He's not a lockdown defender. He's not a guy who's taking the opposing team's best player and putting them in a straitjacket, so to speak, a la Ben Simmons. And it's weird because he's a good defender, but doesn't seem to be in that same mold as being able to, control or contain guys. And he's also not always getting the benefit of the doubt with the calls. Doc Rivers had to challenge that block he had late and against Cole Anthony to try to, salvage the fact that Matisse did get a clean block and then kind of follow through with his arm to hit Cole. But or maybe he didn't, but the call got overturned. Matisse's great defense was rewarded on that rear view contest. But it's weird that the Sixers are having these issues. Matisse and his role continue to kind of be defined. Can he be the type of player that the 3-and-D guy that we want? Maybe he can be that, but he's not quite that yet. And him being an X factor in the playoffs, is that something you can rely on? Is that something that, the Sixers really don't have a choice of to put him in positions where he can try to succeed? And hopefully it does come to fruition for them, and in a way that they can depend on it here over the end of the regular season, going into the playoffs, because there's a little bit of an identity issue going on there. But as he fits in the starting lineup, Danny Green's return really made me think about, where Matisse might be best used. And in my head, I feel like his energy coming off the bench and Danny Green's veteran presence in the starting lineup, and being another shooter that Harden can find, in the half court, really surrounding him before all four guys who can really put it in the basket from outside, I think benefits the team more in my eyes, as opposed to Matisse being out there. If Danny Green was quicker, maybe, the 2-year-ago version of Danny Green would have been perfect in that starting lineup with Matisse's energy off the bench. But I think it still would be a better alternative than the sometiminess of Matisse. I think his energy off the bench might benefit them more. That's just the way I look at it.
Yeah, I mean, we saw pre-Harden trade the Sixers with Thybulle as a starter versus Green as a starter, and all the other pieces being the same. The team was significantly worse. They played better with Danny Green on the court, even if his individual production didn't leap off the page. Just the fact that he takes every shot he gets and defenses respect him, as opposed to using the defender on him as a roamer, that's a huge difference, and it made a very large tangible impact. I think obviously it's still early with Harden, and it's still fair to wonder if Harden's presence can significantly elevate Thybulle offensively. We've seen little flashes where that has been the case, and we see little instances where Thybulle does chip in with really positive offensive contributions. Last night, he was awesome in transition in that first quarter, and he also got a couple offensive rebounds, and just certainly was not a negative on that end of the floor, which is all the Sixers need. Not a major negative, frankly. So I think we now have to wait and see what Danny Green can bring to the table, because these injuries have been plaguing him throughout this season, and we don't know whether he's going to enter the playoffs at anywhere near 100% health and what he's going to be able to provide the Sixers. But I think with Thybulle, there really is no one like this guy in the league. I don't think it can be overstated how exceptional he is defensively and how he just blows up plays that no one else could blow up. Last night, so much of what he did defensively was not what you teach. He just freelances. He sees
like a free safety. Yeah,
he sees Shake Milton is on Jokic in the post, and he just flies out of nowhere to block the ball, and he sprints wildly across the floor to double team Jokic just improvisationally and gets the steal. And these are very high impact plays, and what Doc Rivers is, of course, talking about when he says needing to be dynamic defensively. Obviously, that's checking that box when he's playing this way. But because there's the pressure on him to be that sort of player, I think a lot of these costly mistakes are inevitable. Like he fouls Bones Highland on a 3-point attempt, and in the Orlando game had a costly reach-in foul, and makes these mistakes that you just sure would love to avoid in the playoffs. So you mentioned the word dependability or reliability. Obviously, that's the last thing that comes to mind with Thybulle. but the variability is very high. When he is great and when he's helping the Sixers, he's
The
really
interchangeability.
Yeah, he just totally flips games with his defensive impact. But look, I mean, heading into last night's game, slow starts had been a massive problem for the Sixers over the past month. Leading into the Orlando game, the month before that, they had the worst net rating in first quarters in the NBA. They were 29th in defensive rating. And some of that has to be attributed to Matisse Thybulle starting and not doing especially well as a starter. So in my mind, there's not an easy answer here yet. I'm a little sympathetic to Doc Rivers having someone who there's no precedent for a guy like Matisse Thybulle. This is just not common to have a player who is this unique on both ends of the floor in good and bad ways. And I have no idea how it's going to pan out other than to say he's important for the Sixers in the playoffs. If he's dynamic enough defensively to warrant being on the court and chips in enough offensively to further bolster that case, that raises this team's ceiling to a great degree, I think.
Yeah, and the Sixers putting a lot of their eggs in Matisse's basket, particularly keeping him out of that trade for James Harden. And I think that's the thing that so many fans are waiting for and hoping for here at 25 years old, for him to put it all together, to put together, some of the three-point consistency, to put together some of that cutting and slashing to the basket and, getting in that dunker spot and the high-flying nature. I mean, he can jump out the building, but you really don't see that aspect of his game as much as you would like. But in contrast, I think that's the thing that people love about Tyrese Maxey is they can see the, conjoining of all of his skills and him, using them on the court to impact the game in so many ways. And particularly coming off these Brooklyn and Orlando games, to see him have a stronger game against the Nuggets when James Harden is playing well is important. I think it's important for Maxey to pick up some of the slack if he is, the player that we saw in the Knicks games and the Timberwolves games and the Cavs games. If he is that dynamic player that can be a part of this, triumvirate or quartet with if Tobias Harris is included with Harden and Embiid, then I think that consistency, obviously from a second-year player, is something that you're, hoping for and surprised that you're getting, but not, expecting. But that's part of the thing that people love that Maxey has been able to contribute, is that surprising dependability that maybe, Matisse isn't able to bring yet. So to see, Maxey bounce back, and I think the thing that we had seen in the Nets and Orlando game is a little bit of that deferring, a little bit of that, kind of just trying to find his way with Harden and Embiid. And, even at the end of the game, we saw him wide open for that three-pointer that Niang could have hit him with after that offensive rebound to possibly tie the game and send it into overtime, but didn't quite get there. What did you see from Maxey last night that you didn't see in the other two games? And how do you feel about the way that he's trying to, make sure he's trying to stay aggressive, and that's what people want from him, but it doesn't always, play out on the court the way that it benefits the team most.
Right. I mean, of course, most players on this roster in the rotation are more dependable than Matisse Thybulle, but it does seem like Doc Rivers and the Sixers have some concerns there about Maxey, frankly, as well. The critique of his defense after the Brooklyn game was understandably quite harsh. They reviewed the film and showed him numerous mistakes he made against a former teammate in Seth Curry, just giving him way too much space and getting caught on screens and biting on pump fakes. And I don't think there's a great level of trust right now in his defense in a playoff setting. And that's not an effort-based issue. It's just he does not have the same level of success there, frankly, as he has had thus far, offensively. But we know with Maxey, he's determined to keep improving, as you said, and he learns and picks things up really quickly. I thought last night he was decisive about picking his spots, and I think even before Harden's arrival this season has been sharp at making plays out of that corner. The ball's swung to him, and then boom, it's either quick catch and shoot, or it's a pump fake and pull up jumper, or it's a strong drive baseline and massive dunk. I think all of that's excellent.
Don't forget the floater too.
The floater's there, but the Sixers don't want him shooting it, more than he has to. But I think just the comfort level in that corner is nice to see, and is probably going to come in handy in the playoffs when defenses blitz Harden, or the Sixers are swinging the ball around the perimeter after one of their stars draws help, and it's on Maxey to create something good out of the corner. But the Brooklyn game was likely his worst performance of the season on both ends of the court. And I think it's nice that he bounced back from it and just didn't lose confidence from all of the criticism that came his way after that game, and just the failure on a big stage. It didn't bother him, kept his head up, and kept trying to be Tyrese Maxey, and that's great for the Sixers. And then the other thing notable to me is, okay, he didn't do a ton as a facilitator last night, but no turnovers in 40-plus minutes. And as we've learned with this team, one of the aspects that they need to be successful is just taking care of the ball well. Didn't happen in the Brooklyn game, and against elite opposition, when the Sixers are careless with the basketball, it's probably going to cost them some games. And Tyrese Maxey tends to take care of the ball quite well, and that's a nice element he brings to the table.
The Sixers have been much better on the road than they have been at home, and the standings are still continue to be super tight, like Shaquille O'Neal in medium-sized shorts. Sixers currently 3 games out of first place. Chicago Bulls on their tail, as are the Boston Celtics. The Sixers in the 3rd seed. They would play if the playoffs started today. Wednesday's opponent, the Cleveland Cavaliers, which I think is the best matchup for them in the first round. But once again, it won't be a gimme for them to be able to get to the Eastern Conference Finals, as it has not been for so long. But the hope, and like I said, the honeymoon period seems to be over. The hope had been that the Sixers team suddenly had some great momentum and an offense that offensive juggernaut that kind of couldn't be stopped. We see them coming back to earth a little bit, and the opportunity in the second round will be interesting and how that plays out, whether they get Brooklyn in the first round or not. The second round will be a tough task for them to overcome whoever they play. But let's take a time out here and get into the Jokic and Embiid matchup, some of this bench action as the Sixers had a tough showing there. As we take a time out here in the Sixers Talk podcast, we'll be right back. Stay with us.
Start college, build skills, and complete your degree with Wilmington University. 100% online options and affordable tuition makes WilMU work for you. Learn more at wilmu.edu.
Reigning MVP runner-up. Could that play out once again with Joel Embiid chasing this most valuable player award that he wants? And I think if Joel wins the scoring title, he'll probably win the MVP award. You see the Lakers continuing to go into the tank. I don't know if LeBron James – I mean, it does play into LeBron playing more hero ball, but I try to, put them on his back. But let's focus on the matchup last night. First time since 2019 these guys have been on the court together, Noah. It had been a long time coming. And, you kind of poke around social media and you bump into these debates sometimes with fans and, media members as well, talking about the impact between what Jokic brings and what Embiid brings. And I think it has followed Jokic a lot, the fact that fans feel like he gets jobbed on foul calls quite often. And we saw that play out in an ugly way against the Miami Heat when he got that hatchet job from one of the Morris twins and then responded by, running up on him and banging him in the back. And, Morris is just returning from that injury. Both teams kind of got into it. And we also saw a little bit of the tempers flaring last night with Harden and Cousins, which was interesting to see them go nose to nose. But watching last night's game, there were definitely several times where he did get fouled and it didn't get called. One, Matisse Thybulle kind of got him on the arm, but it didn't get called. And they had the replay, thinking it was a great block by Matisse, but it actually turned out to be a foul, if you're watching it from home. And, that kind of played out last night. Embiid, inducing the fouls also played out last night. And in the head-to-head matchup, you kind of have to give the head-to-head matchup to Embiid. Obviously, Jokic was fantastic in a lot of ways, and his team won. Did last night's game give you any lean, or you leaning either way as this MVP matchup between these two guys is really neck and neck down the stretch? Did last night's matchup force you in any other direction? I would guess that you were probably already leaning Embiid MVP, but I'll let you speak on where you felt like last night's matchup may have induced your feelings.
I don't know personally if I'm leaning one way or the other right now.
You're on the fence.
It does feel like legitimately pretty close to me.
Okay.
I'm fortunate that I don't have to make the tough decision there as a voter. And yeah, I'll examine it.
I didn't think you were that on the fence.
I'll examine it at the end of the season, see where I feel. Yeah, I mean, if you had to, make a decision right now, I guess my gut feel is it Embiid, but I'm not 100%.
I think if it's that close, like you're saying, I feel like so many voters will lean Nikola because he is the reigning MVP. So that just kind of becomes like a, not for lack of a better term, like a lazy vote, but it just makes you lean more his way because he's the reigning MVP and it's so neck and neck. But
the counter to that is what arguably happened with Giannis, where there's almost fatigue to how great a player is, and some of their accomplishments go overlooked, and you buy in more fully into Embiid's excellence. And of course, every voter's different and has their own criteria and own way of looking at this. I think like either player would deserve to win an MVP. I feel that way strongly and continue to after last night. I think overall, yeah, Embiid was in the head-to-head minutes. He looked a little bit better. Looked like, as is the case with almost everyone who guards Embiid, Jokic defensively was reliant on Embiid missing makeable mid-range shots. And he didn't trouble him, especially with anything he presented as a defender. But Jokic is, of course, different than the typical center in that he's doing almost everything for Denver's offense. Like, feels like every shot that team creates is a byproduct of how great he is and how much attention he draws and how creative and exceptional he is as a passer. So both players are great. Not breaking news. I think last night was odd in that the minutes when both guys were off the floor were very influential in how the game turned out. So you had the stretch in the second quarter where Embiid sits and Denver goes on a big Jokic-led run where DeAndre Jordan struggles to handle an MVP, as you would expect. And then the stretch early in the fourth quarter where Jokic is off the floor and surprisingly DeMarcus Cousins plays well and Embiid, lets a lead slip. Despite Jokic sitting, and you figure that being a situation where the Sixers could capitalize. So Jokic's team won. Embiid arguably played a little bit better. I'm sure you could construct arguments to the contrary. To me, it probably should be a close race, and there are good arguments for both guys as things currently stand.
It seemed like Embiid was out there trying to prove a point. We saw him with the pump fake dunk right off the top for his first 2 points of the game. And the Sixers were on the second half of a back-to-back, and somehow with all that adrenaline and the excitement going into this matchup between these two, the big fella asked out of the game about 4 minutes in. So was that just a legs issue of playing the back-to-back and flying back from Orlando and having to face Denver? Was it too much adrenaline? What was going on? And Doc Rivers mentioned that really threw off the rotation.
Just said that Embiid was tired. He did play over 40 minutes in Orlando. It was an unexpectedly grueling game, and the Sixers managed to pull off the win in overtime. Rivers did say it hadn't happened before with Embiid, but the way he presented it, it was impactful and was not what he was hoping to unfold in that situation. Embiid described the back-to-back as tough and said he's starting to feel it a little bit physically, but for the most part, his instinct, like, should I sit or should I not sit? Of course, it's keep playing, and he wasn't going to miss a matchup against Jokic yet again when it was doable to play in this game, and he wanted the Sixers to get a win in a big spotlight. I guess it's not something you expect to happen frequently with Embiid, but he's played a lot of games in a row. He's a big guy. He played over 40 minutes the prior night on a back-to-back, and it was unfortunate that, at least in Rivers' mind, that threw things off a little for the Sixers. But I think it would be an exaggeration to call that a huge part of why this game turned out the way it did. I mean, the Sixers took a 19-point second quarter lead and started very strongly. So it's not as if Embiid having some unexpected early game fatigue totally, tanked the team's chances of winning this game. Obviously, Embiid was a positive impact player. He did well against Jokic, but it wasn't enough for the Sixers to win. And that's essentially how Embiid framed it at the end of the night. Like, he appreciates that Jokic is a great player, called him a monster, but said the bottom line here is he wants to help the Sixers win games, and he was disappointed that he couldn't achieve that last night.
The bench is not helping the Sixers win games. Outscored 48-14 by my math. As we mentioned, Niang's tough shooting night. He goes 2 of 12. Danny Green makes a return, ends up with a donut on 0 of 5 shooting. And we talked a little bit about DeAndre Jordan and the bunnies that he missed on 1 of 6. And Shake Milton, the end of the bench coming in for 8 minutes. And he did make a 3, which was important at the time. But I think 2 things with the bench. One is Doc's reluctance to even experiment with the Maxey Reed scenario or how that might change the flow of the game as opposed to DeAndre Jordan. And then maybe the sudden realization that he'll have to return to Furkan Korkmaz with the way the bench, his lack of production, and reincorporate him into the rotation to try to ignite the bench or figure out how these rotations can work. Doc Rivers once again having to make decisions and choices that can determine how this plays out for the Sixers in the future. And his role as a coach and his position in NBA history is already cemented. But here and now, how he's able to adapt will determine maybe how people remember him, particularly coming off of this Clippers job where things didn't work out. Now he's in the Sixers job where he's trying to figure out this dynamic and has these great players. I'm optimistic that Doc can get to a point where he figures out how all this works and incorporates together. I'm a little disappointed or reluctant of the fact that he doesn't experiment as much. I mean, there aren't a lot of games left, and maybe the time for experimenting is starting to wane. But this backup big minutes and who plays when and the maybe the opportunity maybe to go small that he doesn't seem to want to embrace. All that is there, but at a certain point, it has to be the players on the court who shoulder most of the blame and their production and how they play. And that's part of the reason Furkan Korkmaz is on the bench, because he was awful on the court. He just was not producing. And where are you at with that, whether it's the rotation and who Doc has on the floor together or the actual players actually showing up and playing well is more of the issue with the Sixers bench?
Thus far, I think the biggest issue post-Harden trade has been the players on the Sixers roster who need to play bench minutes have not been good enough to make this team look like a formidable championship contender every game. Of course, they've played some great games. I mean, they started 5-0 with Harden, but even that was largely built on the top-end talent on the team.
Top heavy, like you said before.
Yeah, I think it's probably fair to classify them as such. I mean, even in the Orlando game, the bench differential was 51-19, and Niang had 16 of those bench points on a strong shooting night. Didn't get much besides his outside shooting in that game. I just think with Rivers, of course, he plays a key role here and that he's got to push the right buttons, and clearly didn't last night, like specifically with how he handled the Niang versus Thybulle situation, at least arguably so.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot of weak spots to work around. I thought it was interesting in the Brooklyn game, they only played 8, and I asked about why he went that route, and he said basically the team was getting its butt kicked and he wanted the 8 best players on the floor in that particular situation. So it seemed like the way he views this, when things are going south, he doesn't rely on his depth. And that's contrary to a recent comment he made that
about 11 deep in the playoffs.
11 playable players, but like you actually find yourself in a spot where things are going wrong and you need to resurrect a situation for your team. The way he sees it, understandably, is I need guys I can count on to be solid NBA players, and I don't know if the confidence is there, justifiably so, that the Sixers have a ton of those guys on this team. As far as like the Korkmaz question, should he come back soon? I mean, sure, last night I don't think it would have been ridiculous to throw him back out there. The bench shot 4 for 24. Niang was tired and not shooting well. Maybe Korkmaz could have flipped the script, but I still think giving Isaiah Joe sustained minutes, to me, the sentiment there is still why not? Joe was out of the rotation, of course, last night with Green back in there, and the Sixers used 9 guys, not including Joe. He's a shooter, and maybe he can, in some situations, be an answer for this team. But it feels like now we have somewhat shifted to playoff Doc Rivers mode, where he's reluctant to play young guys and try a bunch of different things. And it's very game-to-game, situational, matchup-based. Of course, gut feel is a big part, but he is looking at it as like, I want to treat this like the playoffs. And thus far, that hasn't gone well in terms of the Sixers bench giving the team what it needs in most nights.
easy contrast to draw during last night's game because you talk about Doc Rivers and his reluctance to maybe lean on young players and, who plays in the rotation when the playoffs come and, who's getting the minutes and which, guys he depends on and how Isaiah Joe isn't getting quite the look he needs. Or you could say the same for for Paul Reed and Charles Bassey as well. But on the flip side, like I said, the easy contrast to draw is you got Bones Highland going nuts against the Sixers, the Wilmington, Delaware product with 21 points off the bench. I mean, he's a rookie getting all types of opportunity, and you definitely will see him in the playoffs for the Nuggets. So I guess it's kind of the taste or the flavor of the coach. And Doc Rivers has shown he's not a huge, young player guy or playing them in minutes or opportunities where, it's crucial or, a veteran could have, more presence and effect there. So easy contrast to draw is, this Bones Highland and, even that three that Joel talked about in the post-game show where he kind of got lost in the switches and left him wide open and didn't think he had enough time to get the shot up, and he ends up drilling the three. I'm sure he had plenty of people in the stands there supporting him, and good for him to have a homecoming like that, but he really torched the Sixers.
Big time, yeah. He had many supportive folks in the audience. He had Wendell Smallwood, former Eagles running back and Wilmington native, in the front row, dapping him up. He savored every second of that experience, and that was cool to see. Kid that's easy to root for, and
hell of a nickname.
Great nickname, just a fun style of play. And a small pat on the back, I remembered pre-draft, I did mock draft him to the Sixers, which did not seem to be. But he stepped up, made huge shots. And I think, though, to just be clear about my point, if I wasn't,
go ahead.
I think Doc Rivers, hasn't handled things perfectly, obviously. But by and large, I just feel like he has so many impossible or near impossible decisions because of the hand that he's been dealt. Mm-hmm. That doesn't make him immune from criticism. It doesn't mean that he's making the right call game after game, because he certainly is not. But the Sixers don't have a Bones Highland on their roster. They don't have a microwave scorer. They are very short on dependable bench players. And Niang, to his credit, has been their best bench player. But even Niang, the Sixers obviously feel great about him offensively and like the fit with Harden, but you see defensively in the playoffs, there are going to be major question marks there. And then the flip side is Matisse Thybulle and all of the questions that his uniqueness presents for Rivers as well. So I do think he's in a tough spot in many different areas in determining how he substitutes and what lineups he uses and who he puts on the floor. And of course, his playoff resume over the last decade plus does not inspire faith in him to nail that. And it does feel right now like he will perhaps not have a great margin for error because of the roster being one that's weak in quite a few spots. So we'll see how it pans out. But I don't think all the culpability or all of the responsibility should fall on his plate. He's not the guy who assembled this roster, but he's the one who has to coach it, and we'll see the job he does on that when the games really matter.
They're definitely going to need James Harden to be great every night out in the postseason, and contributing and making this team look like what it looked like in those first 5 games. I mean, here he's 8 games in, they're 6-2 with him. There's definitely a lot of positives to draw, but you can see the Achilles heel in a lot of instances, and it makes you wonder, man. Just you mentioned their lack of a microwave scorer and how the trade was constructed and how they got Paul Millsap instead of a guy like Javon Carter in the trade, who they eventually allowed to go to Milwaukee. Like, why didn't they try to go after like maybe Isaiah Thomas or Tyreek Evans or somebody who was maybe pining to get back in the league and had that microwave offensive ability or just offensive ability that this team doesn't have. So Isaiah Thomas, looking good for Charlotte. So would have loved to see him in this rotation with the Sixers in some aspects. But a lot of that remains to be seen. Your thoughts before we get out of here, Noah?
Yeah, I think it's difficult now in part because like the young players on the roster haven't quite performed to expectations. If you're talking about Shake Milton and Furkan Korkmaz being around 30% or even lower from 3-point range, like that is, a disappointment and is not what the Sixers thought they were getting heading into the season. Even remember back to the start of last training camp, Doc Rivers thought Milton could be Lou Williams, Jamal Crawford-esque for this team. Mm-hmm. And that's not, I don't bring that up again to bash Milton or to highlight a interesting comment that Rivers made in the past, but just to say that it's not all on anyone. There's a lot of shared responsibility here. Part of it's the lack of expected internal development with players not named Tyrese Maxey. Part of it's the way the roster has been built and going all in on stars. And part of it's Doc Rivers, making questionable calls at times with how he uses these pieces. But you don't want to overlook what you just said. They're 6-2 with James Harden, number 3 in the East. If the season ended today, they'd have a matchup against Cleveland that I think they'd feel really good about. And it's all about peaking at the right time. A few players have mentioned that kind of in trying to explain some of the growing pains and how they view their situation. And I think that's exceedingly fair. And it's still an unanswered question if they'll be able to do that. I don't think it's an unachievable task. I think when you have an MVP caliber player and a 10-time All-Star in James Harden, who has demonstrated how he can make his teammates better in many ways, a lot of things are possible. So I don't think the little speed bump here, rules out that the Sixers can achieve their lofty ambitions. But I think it does bring into clearer focus just that is going to be very, very difficult. But I guess, hey, we knew that. Winning NBA titles is hard. City hasn't done it since 1983. And Joel Embiid and James Harden want to, but it's very, very difficult to win NBA championships. But I think, as you said, like getting further in the playoffs, that feels important in and of itself. Like they need to get beyond the second round. Doesn't matter if they have to go through the Brooklyn Nets or the Bucks are playing great basketball and
or the Heat.
Or the Heat. Yeah, like a lot of tough teams that they might have to go through to get to these finals, but it does feel like at a minimum for this season to not be a disappointment, the Sixers need to make it there. So it's a team with like a high level of variability. They could lose in the first round if they get a bad matchup and some of these flaws rear their various ugly heads. But they could go to the NBA Finals. No one would be surprised if that happened, of course.
Yeah, all these teams have flaws. Just the Sixers, if they can manage the flaws that they have. But look at the end of the season, man. 15 regular season games to go. They talked about having a rest schedule for Joel Embiid and James Harden that is flexible, they said, but they're going to be rested some of these games down the stretch. They got 3 back-to-backs left. So we'll see how it plays out. But definitely no cakewalk here for the Sixers, and a tough slate this week. Cleveland, Dallas, Toronto, Miami, just and the West Coast road trip thereafter, punctuated with a matchup at home against the Milwaukee Bucks. So a lot of tough games to go. We'll see who plays when and how the Sixers work through some of these things. But make sure to check out Noah Levick's work on NBCSportsPhiladelphia.com. Follow him on Twitter at Noah Levick as he carries us through all of the ins and outs here of the 76ers team. We love your work, Noah, and we appreciate your dedication to your craft. For Noah Levick and Ben Berry, I'm Danny Pommells. You've been listening and watching the Sixers Talk podcast brought to you by Wilmington University. WilmU Works. We'll see you next time.